My name is Mike Lejeune, and I'm president of Lighting the Path Training and Development. I'm also on the board of the Houston Area Association of Personnel Consultants, and I serve on Josh Beasley's committee, who is our program chair. And we were just honored to work together. My company, HAAPC, back in February, we put together our first annual virtual recruiters conference, and we had 3 days of speakers, and it was awesome. And Rob Mosley was one of those, and we're just really blessed and grateful that Rob graciously agreed to come back and do a continuation of the message that he shared with us before. And so I'm going to turn him loose in just a second. But I want to thank you for connecting up today. The Houston Area Association of Personnel Consultants, if you look at it's one of its key mandates that we have, is to raise the standard of performance for the recruiting industry. Our belief is the more that we raise the standard of performance, it increases the visibility and the level of importance that people place on us. And it actually makes it easier for us to compete because of the fact that the standards are higher for the clients that we interact with. And that's our goal, right? Have the clients raise their standards of what they expect out of us. And we've, since the very beginning, over 50 years ago, when the Houston Area Association of Personnel Consultants was first formed, the key mandate was bringing educational opportunities and resources to our membership. And so right now, what we've been doing is offering these free virtual training programs, not just to members, but to the marketplace. But we're looking at somewhere probably by fall is that if you're a member of the Houston Association, you'll continue to be able to participate in these programs for free. But for those that are not, there'll be a cost that's involved with it. So I just encourage y'all, if you for some reason, if anybody's online who's not a member, join up with us. We're laying some groundwork right now to actually expand our reach beyond Houston. You're going to be hearing about that over the course of the next 90 days. And so I was honored to serve as the MC, the coordinator for the virtual conference. And when Josh and I were brainstorming on who do we put in and invite to participate, we looked for people who were I call them tacticians. In other words, they were really technically good at this business and to raise that standard. But there was another component that was important to us, is that we wanted people that their message had a strong sense around the heart of what our business is. Because at the end of the day, if you look at what we do as an industry, what the recruiting industry is about, is we literally change people's lives. We change people's lives. We're not supposed to be judged. We're not supposed to judge ourselves by, sort of out of what we do. But the reality is, we're human beings. We get our sense of self-worth out of what we do. And so if you think about the fact that whenever somebody is having challenges with their work, it has a huge impact on their self-esteem. When companies have cogs in their wheel that aren't spinning properly, it affects more than just that job. It affects the whole overall organization, including the culture of the organization. And so when it was easy for me, when I was looking at the potential people we could invite to speak, to reach out to Rob. Rob and I have known each other for a number of years, been blessed to have shared the platform with him. And he's just a guy that looks at this business, I think, from a unique set of eyes. And what we're going to hear about today is the power of persuasion. We're going to hear about the power of persuasion. But I know that when I got into this business as a rookie, the way we were teaching, the way I was taught was the way we persuade is we try to close. And it was almost somewhat arm twisting. It was very closing and convincing the candidate that the decision that they need to make was the one that we thought was best. And what we're going to listen to today is how do we have more impact in the marketplace, specifically by building the word influence. If you look at what our industry is about influence, and our success with both clients and candidates has to do with our effectiveness in influencing others through the placement process, not controlling, but having influence and impact. And so Rob leads the training initiative for an organization called Next Level Exchange, which is one of the preeminent training organizations in the country. And he has been a friend of the Houston Area Association of Personnel Consultants for a number of years. So Rob, I thank you for coming. We don't have a lot of cameras on, but if you can see, all the cameras are on right now. I will show you how you applause in a virtual setting. You know, Jennifer, help me with this because your camera's on. This is how you applause. So thank you, Rob Mosley.
Awesome, wonderful, Mike. Thank you, brother. As always, it's an honor and a privilege to be a part of anything that you and HAAPC puts on. And I realize we have been doing this for a while now, which is awesome. It's good to always celebrate those wins, and I anticipate that everyone else on this call will have a chance to be collaborating for many, many years to go. For those of you who are coming on to this session and were not with us just a little over a month ago to the phenomenal virtual training conference that Mike and team put on, I introduced a program. It's a larger program, but I introduced a part one called Negotiating Client Tactics and Demands. It got a lot of traction. This, for those of you who are with us, is a part two. For those of you who were not with us, no worries. This still stands alone and works in conjunction. But I'd always like to tell people is that this is a snippet of a much larger program. And I say that just because an hour and a half never quite does a topic justice. I remember as a little kid, I think my mother had just come back from Hawaii and she was trying to impress her friends with the word poo-poo platter. I didn't know what that meant. And now as an adult, I think I'm getting ready to provide you my version of the poo-poo platter, which is samplings, a little bit of everything around this really fascinating topic of negotiation. And by the way, it's not negotiation as you might think about it. It certainly can be about the contractual terms and conditions part of our business. But what it really is at the heart, what Mike alluded to, is about the art of influence. I can't force behavioral change on anyone. I can influence how they see me in a situation. And the negotiation process is driven almost completely off this idea of being able to develop influence with both clients and with candidates. And as always, this is brought to us in a partnership between Next Level Exchange and the Aclavus Corporation. Now, try saying that 50 plus times a day in client development mode. It's Latin, and it means inclined upward. And it speaks to the fact that we're all responsible for influencing how our clients and candidates see us, from what initially might be just another vendor or recruiter to hopefully a strong supplier provider to ultimately that trusted advisor, that collaborative partnership. By the way, this curriculum you're seeing is not the world according to Rob or Next Level Exchange. It is a collection of best practices that's been delivered in over 88 countries. It's been facilitated in over 14 languages. And I've had the personal privilege of delivering it on 6 continents over the last 27 years. And what I know is where people choose to truly embrace these skills and techniques, business changes and lives are impacted. So I'm always excited about bringing it to you and letting you see what you'd like to do with it and how it applies to your particular industry or niche. I will say one other thing before we get started. For those of you who are either raised in Texas or you're all living here, and I think that's probably most of us on this call, I am fighting the good fight with my allergies today. So if I stop for just a second to grab a drink of water, you will understand my interesting plight about springtime in Texas. Here's the challenge we always have. People judge, consciously or subconsciously. They make decisions very quickly. And you've got several interesting scientific studies that talk about how human beings immediately can categorize. And we don't even know what's happening. We've made a categorization, and within less than a second, that categorization starts to get formed. And by the time we've opened a conversation with clients or with candidates, they've pretty much made a strong, lasting judgment about who we are and what value we bring to them. So our ability to quickly amass these sources of influence, these sources of power, is critical. The other challenge we have, and you don't have to go any longer than the last perhaps political election cycle, is to understand that everyone has a different paradigm. And I love this phrase from a mentor many years back. And it said this: no one sees the world as it is. No one. We see the world as we are, as a culmination of our upbringing and our life experiences. What that means to us with clients and candidates is that I don't have to agree with their perceptions, but I do have to understand it. I have to understand where they're coming from in order to influence and align better with what their particular needs are. Here's some things I'd like us just to think about as we enter today's session. One of the essential factors in any type of relationship, and specifically in negotiations, is this element of trust. And in the first few seconds and minutes of a conversation, someone's thinking, do I trust this person? Do I not trust them? Do they sound legitimate? Do they not sound legitimate? Do they know something about me, the client, or are they just interested in their own role as a recruiter? And for us to be able to establish behaviors that drive trust requires not just the skills, and we're going to talk about that, but when it comes to negotiation, it requires a mindset of confidence, competence, and conviction as we approach each and every conversation. So you'll see that laid over all of these really interesting influencing skills is also that critical mindset. Because nothing's learned until it's fully applied, this is about changing behaviors. And the one thing I'm going to encourage you to do is pick those one or two things that you felt could move the needle for you or your team or organization, and commit to making those behavioral changes, however it might look inside your organization. And again, that goes back to someone's perception in terms of what that might be towards those behavioral changes. The last thing that fits into this negotiation wheelhouse is this idea of not being able just to survive with change, but to thrive during change. Our industry, in some ways, it looks very much like it did when I started in it 35 years ago. And yet, overall, what's changed so dramatically is how people want to be communicated with. And the challenges we have now that we're not always given the benefit of a face-to-face meeting, we've got to find a way to be able to connect with clients and candidates and embrace this technological change in our environment. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today as well. Let me start off with this. You remember this guy? Not the colorful one, the name there at the bottom. I'll refresh your memory because for many of us, it might have been a couple of years since we were in high school. Charles Darwin, we hear a lot about fake news. He actually was the victim of fake news, and it was over 100 years ago. Now, you may not remember exactly what he was famous for, but I bet I can say one word and you can finish my sentence. Are you ready? Survival? Yeah, of the fittest. Well, he never said that, fake news. What he did say, I think is even more compelling. It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It's the most that's adaptable to change. And that's going to be one of our themes today, is providing you with some really fascinating sources of influence that can change how people see us, which then drives how they think and feel about us, and ultimately influence their behaviors with us. And you'll see that connection in just a moment. Let me give you a definition, by the way, of power, because I'm going to be using that word quite a bit. For the purposes of this session, we're going to consider power as your ability to influence others, clients, candidates, your colleagues, maybe your boss, certainly friends and family. Power is about perception. I could be, in reality, the most powerful recruiter in the world unless my client or candidate doesn't believe that to be true, and then it's not. So it's my reality, and yet it's their reality. It's my truth, and yet it's their truth. Power is in the perception. But the interesting thing is, it's not necessarily about somebody's role or title or position. That's not what gives people power. As a matter of fact, if you look on the world stage, some of the most influential, powerful people in this world never held a role or a title. Mahatma Gandhi, led the world's largest democracy, India, out of the bondage which at the time was Great Britain. Now, that guy never had any title. He had never any role. He simply spoke the truth. He was brave, and people trusted him, and they followed him. You look at Princess Diana, and it's arguable that she probably had more influence on the world stage after she lost her title and her crown than she even did before. So the good news for all of us is that we don't necessarily have to have a vice president or owner or CEO title to be influential and powerful with clients and candidates. Here's our definition. This program is about how we position our value or potential value to a client-candidate relationship through the use of power, because that's ultimately how we influence our clients and our candidates' behavior. So let me get started with this. There's a science and a model to how people are influenced. And you don't have to memorize this model, but I want you to know that this is, everything we're going to talk about today is truly a science of behavioral change. And what it says is, if I had that magic consulting wand and I could wave it over my clients and candidates and make them behave, make them act right, there are probably a lot of behaviors that I would aspire to have. Trust my professional recommendations, be transparent with me, return my phone calls, follow my professional recommendations, sign the agreement as stated. Well, unfortunately, none of us have that magic wand, but I can tell you this: clients and candidates' behavior, how they act, how they treat and regard us, is a direct result of what their attitude is about us. One of their attitude is about how they think and feel. Well, let's pull back for a second. If I've got a new client and they don't think that I look or sound or act any different from any other of the vendors out there, I can't force them to think differently. If they feel my professional fees are higher than what they're comfortable paying, I can't force them to feel differently. But attitude, just like behavior, has its roots in something else, and that's someone's perception, how they see me and how they see the situation. And the great news for all of us on this conversation today is that I can influence how someone sees me in a relationship. And the roots of that are an awareness. And we know who's responsible for that. Don't you dare say marketing. Yeah, it's each one of us. As a matter of fact, I would suggest, and I know several of the people on this call today, and you have powerful, long-lasting brands, I would still suggest that for all the brilliant branding and marketing and advertising and social media, the ultimate brand for every one of us is you. It's what you say or fail to say. And typically that's roots of awareness is in the first few seconds and minutes of a conversation. That pours out into their perception, into their attitude, and ultimately their behavior. This is the science for how we influence. Now, again, you don't have to memorize this. I do think it would make an awesome tattoo. I will not ask you to make that level of commitment today, but just know there's science behind everything we're going to talk about. Now, there are three principles that go with this particular conversation today. I like to think about a principle as a moral compass. It's where what's smart in our business meets what's right in our industry. And I've never been the smartest guy in the room, ever, won't be. I can be one of the most purposeful. And I think that when people see us as purposeful, they trust us. They tend to see us more as legitimate. And these are guiding principles. They're moral compasses that help make sure that we're also being right as we are trying to be smart. And there's many principles of negotiation. Here's three I decided might fit our conversation well today. The first is about our behavior. And it says simply, everything we do or say with a client or a candidate has an impact, or else it's irrelevant. Your behavior matters. Your short-term behavior has a long-term consequence. The second is about this idea of influence, which we just addressed. We're going to consider influence as our ability to achieve a desired effect, an outcome, a result, even if we don't have direct authority. And the last is this idea of insight. Insight is a lot more than just information. I think we're inundated with information. Insight is your ability to see into a situation with clients and candidates beyond just what's on the surface. You don't have to memorize these three, but just know that these will be the principles that we're going to explore as we get to the conversation. Now, I don't think we were able to get our worksheets for today out, but our promise to you is following this session, I've got some, I think, extremely tactical and practical worksheets. One of them is called Preparation for Negotiation. It's a strategic document that helps us understand better what we currently know about this prospect or client. More importantly, what more we could know. Now, even though you don't have this in front of you, I'm going to ask you to take a piece of paper, and I want you to write a current client that you feel is one of your strongest clients. Now, later on, you can do this with a new prospect, but by design, I want you to do it with a client you know well. Because the big takeaway is, even those clients who we consider very collaborative, there are still opportunities for us to know more about them. And that's always a changing dynamic process. And within this client organization, because you have depth and breadth, because they're a strong client, I'm going to anticipate that you've got more than just one relationship within that account. So what I'd like you to do is write down the relationships that you have underneath that client name. Could be an executive level relationship, could be management departmental, could be an individual project field, could be a candidate that we've placed that's now an associate for the organization. We're going to learn here in just a minute that there is a complete connectivity with how someone sees you in the relationship that determines how you're going to get treated throughout the negotiation process. And what we're going to do in just a few minutes is have you come back to those three relationships and look at them again through a different lens. And the big takeaway is this: the most dangerous relationship that we typically have is the one that we think is a very cooperative relationship. And that's not what's happening at all. It's actually just competitive, but we confuse rapport and respect. So this is going to give you a little bit more objective way to have an understanding of what's really going on in that organization. And if anyone on this call has ever said the following: wow, after all the things I did for that client, after all the work I did for that candidate, look what they just did to me. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a failure on our part not to understand what was really happening behaviorally in that relationship. So I think you're going to like this next section. It's eye-opening and it's very different. The model I'm getting ready to introduce you is called the Trigon. And what it says is your clients and candidates can choose to see you in one of three fundamental types of relationships, and therefore treat you to one of three fundamental types of negotiation. It's cause and effect. You might want to write this down at the top of your paper. The relationship I have drives the negotiation I get. Cause and effect. The relationship I have drives the negotiation I get. And what it says is clients and candidates, prospects, can choose to see you in one of three types of relationships. They can see you in a competitive relationship, which, as you might imagine, drives a pretty win-lose type of negotiation, not in our favor. They can choose to see you in a more cooperative type of relationship, which is typically characterized by more fairness and equity. But that's a matter of opinion with people. That's a perceptual thing. Every once in a while, not often enough, we have a relationship on either the client or the candidate side that we truly can define as a collaborative relationship. Our role, our work at a large level at 10,000 feet is to take every relationship and drive it from what would naturally be a new competitive relationship up into a cooperative relationship, and not always, but on occasion, to a truly collaborative state. Now, about the time you were in grade school, you were probably introduced to a microscope. And more than likely, you took a little vegetable and you sliced it nice and thin, you put it down on that clear glass tray to see what was actually happening. Well, I'm going to do the same thing with this Trigon. We're just going to slice it open nice and thin, and I want to examine what's actually happening behaviorally at each one of these levels. And then what I'm going to ask you to do is go back to your client organization and those hopefully 3 to 4 individual relationships you have in the client organization and ask yourself this: how is this person treating me today? Is it a competitive relationship? Is it a cooperative relationship, or is it truly collaborative? And if I say cooperative or collaborative, I want you to write down the behavior that tells you that's true, the evidence. So let me get started with these definitions. I want you to look first at life at the competitive level, and you notice that's characterized by the color red. That's extremely important. We should think about this as life in hell. You guys watch the game show Survivor, right? How many people can win in the game show Survivor? Classic win-lose. Well, this is kind of like the game show Survivor in that at the competitive level, our prospects, clients or candidates, do not trust us to a full extent. And because of that, they want to consciously or subconsciously take victory or advantage to win. That doesn't make them bad people. Last time I checked, that makes them human. Because of that, at the competitive level, if our client or candidate insists on winning or taking advantage, that means naturally we have to lose something. But if we try to defeat our clients and candidates at competitive level, and there's the problem. At the competitive level, you can never win. We can't defeat our clients. We can't defeat our candidates. We can only survive long enough to elevate the relationship. The tools I'm going to share with you, these 7 sources of power, are your roadmap to influence, to survive long enough to get your relationships out of the red. They take you from competitive to cooperative and on occasion into a collaborative state. At this level, right, wrong, or indifferent, your clients believe that what they need out of the relationship with you is in conflict with what you need. They need lower professional fees or rates. You need to maintain yours. They want better terms and conditions. You need to maintain your terms and conditions. And by the way, this can happen at any level of an organization. At the individual level within your client organization, like HR or an in-house recruiter, this could be the recruiter or in-house associate that's actually bonused or encouraged not to work with outside resources. At the management departmental level, this could be someone because of COVID protocol, because of challenges in staffing, they've had to cut people back. Suddenly, they've had recruiting thrust upon them. They're not getting paid for it. You're just seen as extra work. Or it could be at the departmental or executive level, and those individuals know that they can save 25, 30, 35% by doing this on their own and not working with you. Those are 3 classic examples of your client seeing conflict between what they need and what you need. Because of that, consciously or subconsciously, they're going to try to position themselves to have victory advantage over you. You've probably figured at this point, there's not a great amount of trust at this level of the relationship. And what there is in terms of trust can easily be destroyed by us not communicating expectations, doing what we say we're going to do, right? Following through on those expectations. Power at this level is exercised against us. Now, I gave you definitions for power. Let me share one more good example. Is a hammer a tool or a weapon? Yeah, it's both. It depends entirely on who's holding that tool or weapon and how they're going to use it. At the competitive level, power is exercised against us. And it sounds like this. Jennifer, we're one of the largest organizations in the United States. We can work with anyone we want to. You can either sign our agreement as stated, or you can choose to work with someone else. That's exercising power against us. Now, look at what's happening here. Look at the behaviors that are happening at this level. I'm going to challenge you on something. Because again, I'll say this, the most dangerous customer, client, or candidate that we have is the one that we think is very cooperative, and that's not what's happening at all. I want you just for a second to look at your relationships, and I want you to take the concept of rapport off the table. Here's an example. We just moved in, we'd lived out in the suburbs for years, the whole lawn thing, and we just moved into a high rise. Our joke is the kids are gone, the dogs are dead. It's time to drop all that stuff. But for years, I did the whole suburban yard thing, and I really liked the guy who took care of my lawn. I had a family physician for some 30 years, and I really liked my family physician. I valued what they did differently. This is about a perception of value. And if you walk into any relationship thinking that this is anything more than what it is, we're all going to be in for a disappointment. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad place. It is a place where there's limited value and a perception of commoditization, right? This is the world of what we call the vendor for the most part. Now, let's be honest, if you're starting off with a brand new client or candidate relationship, unless you have the benefit of a referral or a testimonial and you have some legitimacy built, the truth is we start every relationship at this level and have the opportunity to build. This is one way your clients and candidates can choose to see you in the relationship, and therefore you can anticipate it's how you're going to be treated in the procedural negotiation and the relationship for the longer period. The second way someone can choose to see you is at this cooperative level. characterized by the color green. And at this stage, our clients and candidates are starting to appreciate and value some important aspects of what we bring to them. They may say something like this: yeah, you know, Bruce is one of our preferred providers. We've been with them for decades. Well, because of that, there's naturally this feeling of fairness and equity. Well, here's the perception problem. I may not see something as fair and equitable, and my client says, oh, that's totally fair and equitable. That could be a matter of perception. Trust is balanced, but it's an uneasy balance, right? And all it takes for you having a client, let's say you've had a client for a decade, and you consider them a very strong, stable, cooperative client. All it takes is a merger, a change in leadership, an acquisition, a pandemic, change in regulation, change in environmental legislation. What all it takes is to up-tip that axle car, and suddenly that client that was very cooperative and pretty easy to work with has become very competitive. That doesn't make them bad. That makes them frightened and uncertain. So understand this whole process is dynamic. It's why, we're going to talk about it in a minute, I've consistently got to be building multiple relationships throughout an organization because this changes. It has a dynamic process. The third way, you can be treated in a relationship and therefore can expect a different type of negotiation as at this collaborative level. Now, there aren't many of these out there, but the good news is you don't need too many of these within your wheelhouse to significantly move the needle for your organization. At this stage, your clients see that they would rather work with you than not work with you. It's truly interdependent. That might be characterized by a retainer, by exclusivity, by inviting you in to help craft the RFP rather than just respond to it. You're asked to come in for hiring, strategic business plans. Because of this, the motivation is long-term. It's the optimal return for both parties, that classic win-win. Trust is naturally high and implicit, and they're willing to share power with you, including referrals, testimonials, right? Introduce you to other sources of business. Now look at these three types of relationships and negotiations. You could theoretically have all three of these relationships sitting with one client organization. You might have a relationship with HR or procurement that is very competitive. You might have a relationship with the upper tier executives that's cooperative, right? They're aware of you. And you may have an actually very collaborative relationship with your key player. Let me share one other thing about this, because I think this is where this becomes powerful. Think for a minute about your portfolio of relationships on either the client or the candidate side. Today, and I say this because we can influence this, we can change it, what percentage of your portfolio sees you in a competitive posture? What percentage sees you in a cooperative type of relationship or posture? And what percentage, if any, see you as a truly interdependent collaborative relationship? If we're being honest with ourselves, most of us, and again, this depends on how many years you've been in the industry, how tightly niche focused you are, right? So it's not a one size fits all. Everyone's going to be different. But on the whole, what I hear people say is, oh man, a good 60% of my business is probably competitive, and that can change dynamically. I might characterize 20% of my business as cooperative, and I'd hope to have 5%, maybe 10, depending again on how tightly niche focused you are, of what I consider truly collaborative relationships. Let me make one other observation about this before I move on. Some of us, just because we're all in sales and we're optimistic, are thinking this: oh man, no, I want every one of my relationships to be collaborative. No, you don't. No. There's a real good reason why most of us are just married to one person. That's a lot of work. And candidly, not every client or candidate is going to feel the need for that kind of relationship. And that's not a bad thing. You only need a few of these to dramatically shift the wheelhouse. Now, I want you to think for just a second. If you don't get a chance to spend time now, please do so this at the end of the series. I want you to look at that client organization and tell yourself now, culturally, how are they treating me? You know, for years, I've had the relationship with both Dell and with Walmart. culturally, even though they pay me well, both those organizations treat me like a vendor. They treat me very competitively. The only thing that saves me is within those organizations, I've developed some collaborative relationships that allow me to circumvent the RFP process. And you'll see how this is going to play out here in just a little bit. So when you get a moment, I want you to go back to that really well-known client and ask yourself under this lens, how are these people really treating me, right? Not do they like me, how are they treating me? Because if you've got a relationship and you think it's cooperative or collaborative, but you're still getting called on your terms and conditions, you're still getting beaten down on your professional fees, you're still getting threatened with the RFP process, that is a competitive relationship. Now, here's what we're going to learn. I'm getting ready to provide you with 7 sources of influence, 7 sources of power that help you get your relationships out of the red. You may figure this out. Oh, wow, Rob, today after looking at these 7 sources of power, I've come to the conclusion that I don't have the relationships I need to elevate. That's not bad news. That means now it's time to move on. This is also about where you want to spend your investment of time and energy. You may look at these 7 sources and say, today, I don't have the relationships I need, which means I can either go after those relationships or I can choose to move on to organizations that value what I bring to the table. So again, this is also about your investment of time or commitment. So you'll notice page 1 of your preparation for negotiation, which by the way, we're going to send you in a soft copy and you can just fill it out online. It's a cool little electronic copy. You see the opportunity here right in the center where it says key players and influencers. It's asking you how many relationships do you have currently in that organization? And you see the trigon out to the right. The second page of this negotiation is called a power analysis. And what it talks about are these sources of power, and it asks you 2 questions. What power do I have, and how am I leveraging it with this client opportunity? What power does my client have, and are they leveraging it with me, or are they exercising it against me? So it helps you understand what sources of power exist and how they're going to show out in the negotiation and the larger relationship. Let me introduce you to these 7 sources of power. The first 3 sources are what we call personal power. It's what hopefully every one of us on this conversation brings to every client and relationship. It's our house. It's what we're responsible for. Skills. And by skills, I'm referring to skills and knowledge. But skills are typically those things in our world that end in an ing. Preparing for a call, opening a conversation, qualifying, probing, listening, responding, negotiating, closing, knowledge of our desk, knowledge of our industry, competitive analysis knowledge, all those things that create skills and knowledge. Attitude. Yes, this is pre-pandemic, but you remember this pretty clearly. You'd walk in on a Monday morning to cubicle world, and you would hear this hissing coming out from under the cubicle, and that would be one of your colleagues sucking the life out of the room because for whatever reason, their personal professional life was not in sync. And in negotiation, in relationships, every day is game day for us. And that attitude of confidence and competence and conviction is essential. And preparation is the keys to the kingdom. In these busy times, I have a lot of tenured colleagues say, Rob, I just don't have time to prep anymore. I'd suggest we don't have time not to. Now, these 3 sources of personal power work together to access the 4 core sources of power. And the bridge is between preparation and insight. As I prepare for a conversation, I need to prepare for what I could relate to, what I might know about this client or this candidate beyond just the obvious. And if you're making notes, just note this, that the very first core source of power that we typically tap into is the power of insight. The more insight I have into you, your role, your title, your organization, industry trends and industry, the more insightful I am, the more legitimate I am perceived by you. That's number 2. Well, if I'm perceived as legitimate and a credible source of knowledge in your world, guess what? You're going to tend to trust me in the relationship, to respect my professional recommendations. You're probably going to like me a little bit more, right? Insight, legitimacy, and relationship all work together to drive the perception that we are the best possible solution to help our clients and candidates with those hiring and staffing needs. Now, I'm going to break these down because this is not an academic study. If you read any paper, sorry, millennials, tablet, and start on any kind of article, whether it's about business or politics or sports, these 4 core sources of power show up everywhere. They're the engine that makes the world work. In every article, was there insight gained or insight lost? Was there legitimacy gained or legitimacy lost? Were relationships developed? Were they lost? Who's got the supply and demand? That's need solution, supply and demand, right? It's really powerful. And here's the cool takeaway. It's yours to own in every client and candidate relationship. So let me give you some real tactical pieces about what each one of these 4 core sources of power look like. And by the way, you don't have to use the tools that I suggest to you. If you have other insight tools, like if you've got a good opportunity probability assessment or a good qualifying assessment form, that's an insight tool. That's the power of insight. So you can use those tools you currently have that might fit in these categories to increase your power in all of these areas. Let me start with insight. I said this earlier. We learned something really powerful about this time last year. We couldn't watch the news anymore. It was draining. So we limited our information to about 30 minutes in the morning, 30 minutes at night, which was interesting. And I became aware of the fact that the world has tons of information. That doesn't mean it's insight. To turn information into insight, I need both quality and quantity of relationships within an account. This is also true to a certain degree in a candidate relationship. Right? I may want to know their spouse, if that's appropriate. I may want to know a former employee, a referral or testimonial. That's a candidate 3x3. We're going to call this a 3x3 approach. Now, I'll come back to this, but just at a high level, this says that as I establish my relationship in a key account, my goal, I want to aspire to develop at least 3 different relationships within the account, and ideally at 3 different levels of an organization: executive, management, departmental, individual, project, field. Here's why. I'm trying to understand what this information could mean. What are the implications if my organization acts or doesn't act? If a competitor acts or doesn't act? If my client or candidate acts or doesn't act? I'm also trying to figure out if what I'm hearing is true, right? What am I hearing that aligns with what I believe or conflicts? And again, if you just got one relationship, how are you going to know? You're playing blind Nilla with your account. This is Rob at 6. And if I say so myself, I was a skillful negotiator. Now, you can already tell by that picture that this was way back. This is Rob in the 50s, and he had successfully negotiated with the world's coolest homemade Batman costume, I might add, courtesy of Mom. He had already successfully negotiated with Mom and Dad to be able to go trick-or-treat the neighborhood for an hour during daylight. Now, for those of you not around in the 50s or 60s, this is when you could go out trick-or-treating and come back alive. So I was pretty excited about it. And I realized that my potential on that evening, and that's an operative word, my potential on that evening was arguably the world's largest haul of 6-year-old candy. My probability, another key term, had dramatically increased because I was hanging out with the subject matter experts, the 7-year-olds. They had a strategy for the neighborhood and they knew where all the best candy was. Here's my challenge: time, limited time, because Mom says, hey, you can go out, but when it starts to get dark, I want you home, and then your dad and I will take you trick-or-treating for the rest of the night. So here I am, huge potential, world's largest stash of candy, perfect probability, hanging out with all the right people, doing all the right things, a limited amount of time as I stand on my driveway, looking down my neighborhood block, ears back, cape flapping, trying to determine where I want to target my activities. What am I looking for? Well, I'll share it. I'm looking for lights on, for activity, for some illumination. With that, let me introduce to you a powerful tool that helps us quickly illuminate an opportunity. It helps me more quickly determine potential in an account, the probability of moving it forward and what energy I have to put into it, knowing that we all have a limited amount of time. And what it says is, if we want to quickly, accurately qualify an opportunity, I've got to qualify around these 4 critical window panes. And the first is around client or candidate goals and objectives, problems and challenges, and their needs analysis. Now, the reason why these sit in a pane together is for the following. Maybe no one on this call, but as an industry, we get way too focused on the need. Got a chicken, need a chicken, want a chicken, and not on what's driving the need. So this is a good mantra. Needs never stand alone. Needs never stand alone. I mean, I can promise you, Mr. Whitaker, who's on this call today, didn't wake up this morning and say, you know, I think I'll have a need today. No. Any need he has is probably a result of a personal or professional goal he'd like to achieve, or a problem or challenge he chooses to try and resolve. And if you're just asking about the needs, like a needs analysis, ladies and gentlemen, we just made ourselves a vendor. That's not very differentiating. So we want good qualifying questions in all areas. By the way, let me tell you this. One of the other documents you're going to get, in case you're panicking right now, is 10 pages full of qualifying questions. Because we all drink from a well that somebody else dug. It's a Word document, so you can change them and tweak them. I'm going to give you sample qualifying questions around goals and objectives, problems and challenges, needs analysis. We'll also include 10 great questions to determine financial factors, budget, compensation, pay rate. We'll also send you 10 great sample questions on decision process. Who are the decision makers? Who are the decision influencers? And then, of course, questions around competition. Now, we call it competition, but that's not how our clients and candidates see it. They have options. They can work with us. They can work with someone else. They can do it on their own. They can do nothing. And, of course, the critical factor of timing that sits in all of these. So just know that following today, we'll make sure to get you all of these really cool documents. This is one of them. The one thing I'm going to ask you to do, because it's in a Word document, is don't just file it away. Take those questions. If you like them, keep them. If you like them, but feel you need to tweak them, and that's going to be likely, please do so. If there's something you don't like in there, then what I'd like you to do is to make sure that you replace it with best practices. And what I'm hopeful in each one of these offices I'm talking to is that you will work with your colleagues to create what I call a playbook of great qualifying questions. You should all be submitting your best standards, and this is a really good window to do around. Now, you might have some other areas you want to qualify additionally, but these are some really core areas. That creates a playbook, which, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, is about our behaviors with clients and candidates. That's one of the best indicative behaviors, the type, the strength, and quality of the questions that we ask. So this idea about asking a compelling question is both about what we ask, that's a qualifying window, but it's also about how we ask. And I love this quote by Einstein that I found a couple of years ago. Any fool can offer you answers. It takes real genius to ask the right questions. And what I love about a powerfully positioned question is that I think it's the keys to the kingdom. It's one of the best ways to say, I'm listening to you and I'm interested. If your question is compelling, it's a great way to say, I know your world and I speak your language. It also invites a conversation, right? Rather than a monologue, it now becomes a dialogue. And there are certain probing techniques that I can leverage to make that question even more compelling. We know the power of asking an open-ended question, who, what, when, where, why. That is particularly effective early in dialogues, right? There's also power in the right closed-ended question, which is kind of like a trial close. Now, the challenge with closed probes is that if that's all we're using, it starts to sound like a police interrogation, right? Because it offers just that yes or no type of response. So we'll volley between the two is critical. There's also something I like to call fact-finding questions. I like to hang out in what I call clarify and test land. So I want to double-click on that question. Can you tell me more about that? Can you give me an example? What do you think the contributing factors are? Have you had a chance to see what this might be costing you in terms of your business or your career? Right? Doubling down on those questions. Now, this is one of my favorite techniques, And if you're not using this, or for a lot of my tenured folks, you probably are doing this subconsciously. So I'm going to ask you to do it with greater awareness and more purpose. And it's called leveraging a context and preference or a rationale. You know, we ask questions on occasion, and when trust is thin in a relationship, if you're asking somebody about their career or about what they make, those can be delicate questions. So to help with the context or rationale as to why we need to have this discussion, I'm going to preface the question. Now, you see two examples here, and you notice what we're doing is teeing up the conversation with a statement to turn around and ask a question. One of my favorite, because it's a subtle way to say, I know your space well, might sound like this. In working with over 200 healthcare search and staffing companies over the last 10 years, we consistently hear from our CEOs who have these two concerns, X and Y. How does that compare with what you're currently seeing in your marketplace? You're loading the front end up with legitimacy simply to turn around and say, how does this compare with what you see? You can actually create 10 standard context rationale questions. Think about 10 types of insight you would actually like to share with clients or candidates, but use it as a preface to ask the next question. It's a very subtle way to position your legitimacy. This is called perspective and opinion. This is metaphorically putting your arm around someone and saying, Jennifer, you've been in this business for decades. I value your opinion. From your perspective, what do you see taking place in this search, right? It's personalizing the approach from your perspective and your opinion. Would you share in your experience? And the last one is what I call the either or choice. And we typically know either or choice from a trial close, and it works there perfectly. But this is also about guiding a conversation down to options without it feeling manipulative, right? Would you see the salary or rate increase as being this, or do you think it's going to be higher? Will your decision to move forward be today, or do you think it'll be later this week? Now, it's also important that we tie a bow on every conversation. And the techniques for that are called probing for clarification and probing for confirmation. And I'm going to speak here to my tenured recruiters. I know that at this point in your career, you can lip sync many conversations with clients and candidates, and you know what's coming out of their mouth. I get it. This technique says, I'm listening to you, and even if I absolutely know what it is you just said, I'm going to turn around and make sure I've got clarification. So if somebody says, we don't want to move forward without a stronger replacement guarantee. Well, before I launch into our replacement guarantee, I might ask, what does replacement guarantee look like to you contractually? I don't want to assume that I even know what that means to that person. So probing for clarification is asking them to clarify what they've just said. Probing for confirmation says, so from what here's what I'm hearing from you, X, Y, and Z. Do I have that down? Is there anything I've missed? Is there something you want to add? They're both subtle and nuanced, but they're essential to say I'm listening to you and to make sure we're both in alignment moving forward. Let's talk about this idea of the power of legitimacy, because the more insight I have into a situation beyond the obvious, the more I know about you, your role, your title, your industry, the more legitimate I am. Now, I want you to think about legitimacy in three fashions. And this is a good way to start off this conversation. We now live in a world where communication is characterized by as little as 40 characters, which I find to be lunacy, but that's just the reality. So the question I would have for each one of us is, if you're talking to a new client opportunity, a new candidate opportunity, and they want to have an understanding of what you bring to them, what value you bring, if you were to describe your reputation and that of your firm in the marketplace, your reputation, how would you say that concisely in one or two sentences? If you were talking about your niche expertise, your subject matter expertise, how would you describe that in one or two sentences? And what does it look like when clients and candidates are working together, when you're working with them? What is that approach, your processes, your policies that drives legitimacy? This is a great exercise in a world that doesn't scroll down very often about making sure that I'm clear and concise in communicating my value or potential value to an opportunity. And I always say this, you can use that legitimacy or credibility as a basis for why you're making some early guiding suggestions or recommendations. You'll also see that it's very essential when I'm trying to respond to different types of resistance or defend my position in a negotiation. Here's 3 examples, and that's all they are. These aren't scripts. They're just 3 examples of what that might sound like in the marketplace. And this first one is a consultant that's in an area of biopharma, their reputation. The second around expertise is finance and accounting, banking. And the third is around healthcare, around policies or processes. This is one of those things we tend to overlook, but your words matter. The language determines the conversation determines the relationship, and the relationship determines the outcome. Our words matter, and our selection of how we describe our value is more essential now than ever before. Well, this is another fun framework. And by the way, if following this, if you all, I can't give you the actual PowerPoint, but I'll send a PDF out to Mike and Josh. So if you'd like this as a reference in a PDF, you're certainly welcome to have it. This is also one of your handouts. We've given you a structural framework to have an exercise with your team. If someone were interested in your team's background and its history and philosophy, how long you've been in business, how would you concisely and clearly state that? If they wanted to know about your size and structure and stability, how would you share that information? What is your specific experience or expertise? What does it look like when you're actually working with the client or the candidate? What are you innovative around? And what does it look like beyond the process? What does that post-placement process look like? These are great areas to have what I call critical sound bites, strong positioning statements, which, by the way, drive trust and drive legitimacy and drive respect in the marketplace. Well, both insight and legitimacy work together to help our client see value in the relationship. And if you look at the science for a relationship, there are 4 unique pillars. The first one is this pillar around trust. And what this says is, and I'll use this as an example. In my past, I've worked with Stephen Covey, I'm a provider for the Stephen Covey curriculum. One of the interesting things he talks about is the speed of trust in a relationship. And he has a great book written off that. And he talks about the emotional bank account, where there are deposits of trust and withdrawals of trust. Well, this idea of trust is also balanced with rapport and respect. Trust, respect, and rapport all work together to help our clients decide value. And as you look at the last 2 powers, the power of insight and the power of legitimacy, you'll see that those both drive these 4 critical pillars in the relationship. As you look at that too, here's this power of 3 by 3. I always want to make sure that as I'm establishing those relationships, that I have at least 1 relationship at the executive level, 1 at the management departmental level, and 1 at the individual project or field. That brings us to this last power, which is the power of need solution. And my whole purpose around the power of need solution is that I'm not perceived as this, the vendor. And if you've never seen the definition of vendor in the American Heritage Dictionary, let me share it with you quickly. One who sells as a hawker, peddler, huckster, monger, trader, dealer, purveyor, or tradesman. It's better. The context example in the dictionary is the guy who refers to selling peanuts in the stadium ballpark. So ladies and gentlemen, I think next time we show up on the preferred hucksters list, it's not because our clients don't like us. It might be because they perceive limited value. They see commoditization. And one of the things that we can do to ensure that we are seen as the best possible solution for their needs is to understand how to better position our value. And along the way, and this doesn't make them bad, your clients want you to believe that you need them a whole lot more than they need you. That's just a good negotiation. And they tend to use these driving forces, people, time, and money pressure, options, or taking away options. They want you to jump through hoops, they may not. And so you'll see that there's a powerful way in which we can push these forces back to keep the relationship more balanced. Now I'm going to share one closing thing with you. This is the last tool you'll have in this kit, but it's arguably the most tactical and practical. It's called a counter demand exercise. And what I want to ask you to do is to list the top 5 or 10 if you want to, the top 5 client demands or requests that you hear on a daily basis from your experience, right? And those are some good examples. Then on the right-hand side, I want you to brainstorm with your team on some possible counter demands that you can leverage to keep that relationship equal and appropriate. You might be thinking, Rob, you don't know my client. They're going to say no. That's okay. If you've got kids, you know the power just in asking. Either way, I win, and here's why. If they say yes to all or part of this, I've kept balance in the relationship. If they say no, that's equally important to understand, because now I realize where I really am in this opportunity. And it keeps us from having to say in 2 months, oh my God, after all the things I did for that client, look what they just did for me. Same thing is true on the candidate side. List those top candidate demands that you hear on a daily basis, the ones that are the most obvious, and then write up those counter demands that you might be able to leverage as well. What's fun about this is that it's a Twinkie. It has a huge shelf life. It will work throughout your career, and they don't change that often. And if you can get great at this exercise of demands and counter demands, it will systematically move the needle for you and give you so much more confidence in negotiations, where you'll actually see in negotiations as an opportunity and not an obstacle. And with that, I'm going to leave this last framework, and I will send you this framework. And what it says simply is there's a process, a roadmap that I should walk through anytime I'm hearing a client or a candidate demand. And the first thing out of the gate is the power of listening and acknowledging what somebody just said. It doesn't mean I agree. I hear you. I get it. I can appreciate that price is always going to be important to you. Then, because I reserve the right to be smarter in a few minutes, I want to ask a couple of important clarifying questions on what that looks like. At some point, whether I concede or choose not to concede, I've got to have a strong rationale for my behavior. And if I am going to concede to part of it, and most of the time we do, I want to make sure that I'm asking for a strong counter in return to keep that relationship equal and appropriate. I mentioned earlier that only behavioral change is real change. Guys, this is where you got to practice. This is something you do not want to walk out and wing. But the great news is the way you practice is the way you play. And if you get good at playing with just those top part of this framework in the next 30 days, you will be shocked at how much more confident and competent and able you are in responding to any kind of negotiation. So I'm going to leave it at that and close this out. Mike, I know we're a little tight on time, so my apologies. Hard to believe that I would be in the recruiting industry and be verbose, right?
No, you just said we've been drinking out of a fire hose, Rob. You've been pouring stuff into us. I really appreciate the how much information you were able to impart. And I jotted notes down as you were talking. And at the end of the day, if I were going to pick the thing that just jumped out at me, that captured the heart of this, is that influence is not manipulation. It's not. What you're talking about here is that influence is, how do you influence the information cycle? It's a cycle of getting information from the client or candidate, and influence the information that you're giving to the client and the candidate, and influencing how much they're willing to be open to listening to it. So you're literally influencing the communication channel more than the decision. Because at the end of the day, our job is not to make the decision. Our job is to monitor and be able to help guide that process. And by doing so, then we're seen as a valued ally, as opposed to that vendor that you were talking about. And that's huge. I have a question for you. As a matter of fact, if anybody has any questions for Rob, we're running a little bit long. We're going to hang on to with a few extra minutes. You can drop some stuff into the chat room if you want to. The question I've got is, if you look at the legitimacy type of thing, I think that when I look at people over a period of time in this business, we want to be seen as legitimate. We want to be seen as having a seat at the table. And I want to just kind of end with highlighting that a little bit more. What's 2 things that somebody has to do in their mindset to prepare themselves to guide the conversation to drive legitimacy with both client and candidate?
path. I think that's a brilliantly stated question and comment.
You can stop right there
Insight,
because you said it was brilliant. No, go ahead. So
that is right. No, it is. Insight and influence always swim upstream together or down. They're two sides of the same coin, and it starts with preparation. So the more prepared I am for a conversation by really knowing something about you or your industry or title and communicate that I'm prepared for the conversation, that insight gives me more influence with you. And if you give me more influence, it opens the door to give me more insight into other channels of the organization. Here's the other side of it. We can't influence what we don't know.
yeah. Yeah. And that's where we're, that's that information piece. That's gathering information. We need to be information mongers and be absorbing that. And I love the point that you made about if I'm going to approach legitimacy, in my language, I refer to it as softening statements. What do you put in the front of that to soften up that lays groundwork? I'm preparing a lot of material right now on the subject of framing. How do you frame this legitimate discussion so that it's received the way you want to? And I think that the better we can become artistes in that area, the more impact that we're going to have in the marketplace. So again, I'm going to thank you for your time and your heart and your willingness to serve on this. If you want to go and stop sharing your screen, I'm going to wrap up by showing a couple of real quick things here. Thank you all for being a part of this today. Two quick announcements.